So in this video, I'm going to go over section 4.3 and half of 4.4 here in the Marine Science AS level syllabus. I'm using the course book here from Cambridge as a guide, and I do apologize for both the way I look and the way I sound right now, but I might be coming down with a little bit of COVID like everybody else, so please bear with me and let's go into 4.3 and 4.4 biodiversity. So on section 4.3 in the syllabus, we go over biodiversity. And biodiversity is a degree of variance of organisms and ecosystems on Earth, in this case here, in the marine environments. Being able to identify and protect areas with high biodiversity is one of the most important things when we work on marine conservation. And in general, biodiversity is just very interesting. And if we want to protect our planet and our oceans for the future, being able to see where we have the high biodiversity and identify how to protect it is super important. So let's get on with it. The Cambridge syllabus looks at three different ways of looking at biodiversity. And the first one, species biodiversity, is the way we often look at it. Here we measure the abundance and richness of species in a given place at a given time. So the more different species there are, the higher the biodiversity. Be careful not to confuse biodiversity and biomass. For example, if we look at a huge flock of herring or mackerel, there are a huge biomass, but since there's only one species, the biodiversity is low. On the other hand, a coral reef tends to have many different species, so there will be a high biodiversity on the coral reef. A sandy shore will often have a very high biomass, but since there's few species who can live on a sandy shore, although it has a high biomass, it has a quite low biodiversity when you compare it to like a rocky shore. Genetic diversity describes the variety of the forms of gene alleles within a species. So there will always be variance within a species, genetic variance, and that is what we measure here. Now, if we have a very low diversity in genetic variance, that species can be very vulnerable to diseases or parasites. On the other hand, if you have a high variance, there'll often be someone who will be better at resisting disease and thereby ensuring that the species will survive for a long time. So again, like in species diversity, genetic diversity is a huge advantage. We want as much diversity as possible. The last type of diversity we look at here in the Cambridge syllabus is ecological diversity, and that's a variance of ecosystems or habitats on a regional or global level at one time. It's a bit harder to define because it's hard to isolate a single ecosystem, especially in the marine environment, because all the oceans float together. So the more species there are, and the more evenly they are distributed among the different species, the greater the species biodiversity. In general, ecosystems with a high biodiversity tend to be more stable. High biodiversity will make the ecosystem less likely to collapse, and on the other hand, unstable or extreme environments tend to have a lower biodiversity. So there are many reasons why we want to protect ecosystems with high biodiversity, but also just having a high biodiversity in an environment can help protect the ecosystem by itself. Coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor, but contain more than 20% of the known marine life. And this high biodiversity is a result of a stable and non-extreme environment that provides abiotic and biotic conditions that are close to optimum for the animals who live here. We also have producers living here, so we have a quite high production of biomass, and we'll have many different places where organisms can hide from predators. The rocky shore are a stable, non-extreme environment. The rock provides a good attachment surface for the different animals and plants who live there. Rocky shores also provide protective habitats such as rock pools where animals can shelter and live. Therefore, rocky shores tend to be an environment with a high biodiversity. Now, hydrothermal vents are by definition an extreme environment due to the high temperature, the high pressure. So hydrothermal vent communities are located in an environment that is extreme and hard to live in due to the different abiotic factors. There are very few organisms that are adapted to live here, but on the other hand, those who are adapted to live here can only live here. So hydrothermal vents tend to have a lower biodiversity than, for example, coral reefs or sandy shores. Reef slopes are the steep, sometimes close to vertical walls at the front of a reef. These four reef zones absorb most of the energy and damage from the incoming waves and stormy seas. This means that sandy substrate will easily be eroded away by the currents and the waves, and it's difficult for marine plants to grow here. There will also be a lower biomass because of this. And the loss of energy between trophic levels means that food chains are short and the environment cannot support species at a higher trophic level. The organisms that can survive successfully on reef slope sand habitats include animals that can burrow into sand where we find it, such as worms, clams, sand fleas and crabs. Although the physical conditions are not extreme, they are constantly changing, so the environment is what we call unstable, and therefore it will have a low biodiversity. Now, mangroves and coral reefs are areas with a high biodiversity. They are also areas that help protect coastal areas. Coastal areas in the tropic, for example, are often threatened by storm and storm surges. Having a coral reef or a mangrove will help absorb the wave energy and will help protect the coastal areas from the wind and the storms. So these areas with high biodiversity also help to protect us. So a healthy coral reef and a healthy mangrove forest also help support the human settlements. Climate change is one of the problems that our oceans are facing. Producers that help support a high biodiversity also tend to absorb a lot of CO2 when they do photosynthesis. Phytoplankton and kelp, for example, can be a key to us combating climate change, as when they absorb a lot of CO2, they will help reduce the amount of CO2 in the ocean. So a healthy ecosystem with a strong amount of phytoplankton or kelp or other macroalgae will help combat climate change. High biodiversity ecosystems tend to provide many species that we humans use for food. That could be macroalgae, crustaceans, fish, oysters, or many of the other species that we like to eat. So having a stable high biodiversity system tend to provide good fishings in the area around them. This also goes if we protect the areas. So for example, if we have a protected coral reef or a protected stone reef and we don't fish on the reef, there will still be more species for commercial fishings in the area surrounding it. So the protected area with high biodiversity will be a source for fish and other marine life in the areas next to it. So not only will this help conservation, it will also help to keep on providing good fishing in the area surrounding it. Marine organisms can also be a source of medicine. New drugs can come from marine organisms, and they might also come from marine organisms we don't even know about yet. There are some examples in the book, for example, that marine cone snails have given rise to a new kind of painkillers. Marine worms can be used as medicines against schizophrenia. In corals, we found a compound that can be used for wound healing drugs, and we find anti-cancer drugs for many organisms. So helping protect marine biodiversity also helps protect us. If we have a strong and stable biodiversity, we will get a strong and stable food supply from the ocean, our climate will be better, our coastal lines will be better protected, and our future medicine will be better protected. And also, there's another thing, areas with high biodiversity are just way more cool. And these organisms were here before us, and they deserve their place on this earth. This being Cambridge, we now have to look at a few more keywords: habitat, niche, species, and population. I will go into detail on each of those on the following slides. Habitats are the natural environment where an organism lives. We have many different marine habitats, all the way from the shoreline to the deepest trenches, or from the icy oceans on the Arctic to a warm reef near the equator. So we have many different habitats, and different animals are adapted to different habitats. But a habitat can also be defined on how an organism moves. As we talked about with zooplankton and phytoplankton, they are planktonic, which means they are drifting. They are drifting with the ocean currents and the waves. But if you can swim under your own power, as a fish or a whale or a seal can do, we call it nectonic. And also we have organisms who live on the seafloor, we call this benthic. But we also have parasites, and for them, the host is the habitat. Species are a group of similar organisms that can interbreed naturally to produce fertile offspring. Again, as in many other things in biology, there are outliers. So, for example, a horse and a donkey can get together and produce a mule. But since the mule itself is not fertile, it is a bit of an outlier here. Endemic organisms are species only found in a specific area. An example here could be the Galapagos marine iguana, who are only found at Galapagos. Now, we tend to see more of these specific endemic organisms / species in the terrestrial biology, because in the oceans, all our oceans are connected, so things can move around way more freely than, let's say, for example, snakes on a remote island. Populations are all of the organisms of the same species that live at the same time and space. So we can have many different populations of orcas swimming around in the oceans of the world. The size of a population depends on factors such as food, predation, disease, competition, climate, pollution, and many other biotic or abiotic factors. So, for example, for a population of orcas, food is very important, because there are not really any predation threatening the orcas, while, for example, a flock of herrings could very easily also depend on the predation, either by other animals or by humans. If we have a factor that limits the population size, we call this a limiting factor. So let's say we have a population of snails, and they have enough food, and there's no disease, there's not much competition, but the climate in the area is a thing that limits the population size. Well, then that climate will be the limiting factor for this population at this specific time and place. A niche is defined as the role of a species within an ecosystem. There are a variety of roles or niches that organisms perform in their aquatic environment, and we talked a lot about this in chapter 3, predator-prey, parasite-host, consumer-producer. So please go have a look at chapter 3 again if all this seems quite far away from you.